All right, guys, if you're listening to me right now, this means that you have already opened up your history book and you've thumbed through your pages, you've done your reading. You know that we're talking about the Spanish American War. We're going to talk about what led up to the Spanish American War. We're just going to, chit chat about a few things. The other thing that I want right in front of you is your map in your activity book, activity page 150. I want that in front of you. You're going to be glad you had it. You don't want to have to come back and watch this again. So here we are, and we're talking about the causes of the Spanish American War. We're going to talk about the war itself. We're going to talk about the consequences of that war for the United States of America. So the Spanish American War, it's going to be between America and Spain, but it's going to be about Cuba. We're not going to be fighting on our soil anymore. We're going to be fighting on a foreign soil. We're going to be fighting to help another nationality to gain their freedom. But before you start patting America on the back and say, look, we're going to get the bullies and we're going to make sure everybody's free, always remember there's always going to be something in it for the United States. We're just not going to go willy-nilly and do something without there being some gain for the United States. One thing I also want you to kind of put this in perspective, I want you to think about the year that this is. This is 1898. So this is like, 33 years after the Civil War. Think about how slowly things are being built. That's not a lot of time from the turnover of the Civil War and bringing America back together again. So we're still rebuilding that as we start walking into this situation. So let's talk about what brings it about. If you have your history books open, you should be open up to page 210. What's going to happen? By this point in history, 1895, this is 30 years after this Civil War, Spain, the Spanish Empire, they're just losing stuff. They're no longer really kind of considered a threat on the world's global market, but they control Cuba. And if you look at your map on page 150 in your activity book, I want you to, kind of have that. I've got this right here. I've got everything spread out in front of me. If you look at where Cuba is, and you look at the tip of Florida, how close are those together? Those are really close, like 100 miles. That is not very much. That's really close to one of our borders of the United States, and there's Spain occupying a very prime spot from which to kind of cause trouble if they wanted to enter the United States from that area. So you know that the United States government, they're watching that, seeing what's going on there that's really close to our borders. But what they end up hearing is they hear that the Cubans, they want their freedom. They're trying to fight for their freedom, and they're being soundly defeated by the Spanish army at this point. They're entrenched in Cuba. There's no way that the people are going to be able to get the arms that they need to gain their freedom. So they're trying to fight for their freedom. It's not happening. Press starts coming into the United States saying, the Spanish military are ripping them from their farms and not allowing them to work their farms in case they might, help the rebels or anything like this. And what we're seeing is a really big case of what we call yellow journalism. And of course, you read that in your history book on page 210. Notice our history book is kind of kind about this. They say sometimes papers try to make stories look more shocking than they already were, but the horrors of Cuba rarely needed help. Were some horrible things going on in Cuba? Absolutely. Absolutely. It didn't need to be doctored, but yet it was. Another kind of another type of definition for yellow journalism: sensationalism, exaggeration, literally making stories up. And then once they got a good story, they would flood their papers, whatever outlet they had. There wasn't the 5 o'clock news. We have the 5 o'clock news now, but they would flood the front of their papers with all of these sensationalized stories. And what would happen is they were trying to trigger an emotional response from the American people to, we are kind of like that, the Americans, we are, we fought England and we gained our independence not by ourselves, but we did do it. Here's another people and they're trying to shake off the man and they want their freedom and we need to go help them. But really what the press is trying to do is they're trying to drive an agenda. And we can bring this back to the 21st century today. Do we see the press try to drive an agenda? Do we see the press try to flood the airways with a narrative of what they want to see? Will they give us part of the facts and withhold part of the facts? Yes. Yellow journalism is alive and well today. And it was because it worked then, it's still working. Why give up a good thing? If you can drive an agenda and you have the power to do that, why would you give that up other than the fact that it's wrong? But no. So yellow journalism played a big part in the Spanish-American War, just like we see it being played even today. Sensationalized stories, exaggerating stories, making up stories, flooding the airways, or for them, flooding their newspapers with sensationalized headlines, just trying to really kind of gain that emotional response, which is, again, look out the door. Do we see that happening today? Yes, we do. So here's what happens. The Americans are already kind of impassioned about the stories that they see flooding in from their only local way of getting the news, from the newspapers. So they're seeing this happen. And then what McKinley does, and he's president at this time, we have Americans in Cuba and we're all about protecting our people. That whole idea of imperialism, keeping the Americans safe. So what McKinley does is he parks the USS Maine down in Cuba by Havana, basically to say, you know what, you're playing your little games here, but don't you dare touch an American. Because if you touch an American, then we're in it and you won't like it. So he parks the USS Maine there. Continuing to go on, the Spanish ambassador to the United States writes a personal letter to another individual, another Spanish person within the political scene, writes this personal letter. The letter is stolen by Cuban revolutionaries, and they give it to William Randolph Hearst, who is kind of like the king of yellow journalism. And Hearst publishes this private letter. In the letter, is he negative towards McKinley? You're absolutely right. He is. He's saying he's weak, he's feeble, doesn't really have a lot of respect for him as a president. But, how many times have you written something to somebody that was for their eyes only, and all of a sudden somebody grabs it and now everybody gets to read it and they don't understand who you are as a person? All they know is that you wrote these unkind words, maybe words that they had even said themselves about McKinley, because McKinley hadn't gone into Cuba yet. But here's this non-American saying this about our president, and boy, yellow journalism, let's just push up that emotionalism up another notch. So here we have, there's this uproar over what Delhomme had written. We are being flooded with these stories about what's happening in Cuba. And again, we have the USS Maine parked there. Well, if you've done your reading, you know what happens to the USS Maine. There's this huge explosion. They can't say why it happened, but here's this perceived attack on a USS warship. So McKinley's kind of in this situation that what else is there for him to do but to retaliate for what looks like an overt Spanish attack upon a United States vessel. So the USS Maine, it's bombed, or there's the explosion. I'm not going to say bomb. We don't know. The explosion happens on February 15th, 1898. Remember, this is like what, 33 years after the Civil War. April 21st, 1898, the United States declares war. We are going in, we're going to deal with Spain, we're going to liberate Cuba. We're just going to be the big heroes. So this is what happens. The United States goes in. By April 21st, we've declared war. We're moving our warships. Kind of look at your map. You can see, if you're looking at your map on your activity book, look at the bottom. You can see where the U.S. Navy goes. That's in blue. You can see the U.S. Army, where we deploy from, where we go in red. You can see where the Spanish Navy is, that yellow arrow kind of pointing in there. And then if you look in the upper left-hand corner, we're going to take that spot where Santiago is. See that little spot on the main map? We're going to blow it up so you can see where the harbor is, where they're coming in at Santiago. We see where San Juan Hill is. We see that's where the American Army is going to be coming through. So here we see the U.S., we didn't play any games. Once we do something, we're not going to play with you. We're going to get it done. So we see this kind of happening. By May 1st, now think about this. On April 21st, we declare war. We're going to do it. By May 1st, Commodore Dewey has sunk or captured Spain's Pacific Fleet. They've got two fleets, and we've just either sunk them all or we've captured half of their fleet. So that was a very decisive move as far as what Dewey did. By later in May, we've got them all trapped in the Santiago harbor. So their ships are going nowhere. Again, if you look at your map, you can see where the blockades are. If you look at your key, you can see what the blockade looks like. You can see that harbor. We've got them in, snug as a bug in a rug. They're not going anywhere. So as far as the Navy is concerned, they've done their job. The Navy is no longer an issue for Spain. However, the Army is moving a little bit slower. Remember what I told you. This is 33 years after the Civil War. That's not a lot of time. Building up troops again. Another thing to take into consideration is Americans had not fought in this environment before. They're in the Bahamas, and they're in the Bahamas in summer. So those of my students who have been in the Bahamas in the summer know that it is hot hot. And when you think about the uniforms, the American military uniforms, these were wool. They were heavy, and they were not the right kind of material to go fighting in this environment. Also, the Americans were not familiar with this terrain. This is another thing that caused the American military, the American Army, to move a little bit slower during this phase of our assault on Cuba to defeat Spain. We're not familiar. Our uniforms are definitely not the type of uniforms conducive to fighting in the summer, in the heat, so close to the equator where it's going to be a lot hotter and a lot more humid. These are things that are going to slow the American military down. But over time, we get in there, the American Army gets it done. By July 1st, they go in, they capture Santiago. This was led by Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. They come in, they capture Santiago. By August 12th, Spain agrees to a ceasefire. They realize they're beat. There's nothing for them to do. Now let's talk a little bit about the consequences of what happens because of Spain's ceasefire. Now, I've often said this about the the United States after we beat somebody. We beat you and then we pay you. So this is what happens. Spain agrees to the ceasefire August 12th, 1898. So by summertime, it's over. Spain loses Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. We pay Spain $20 million for all of these territories. Now, when we openly said that we were coming after to liberate Cuba, one of the things Congress said is we were going in with the express intent of giving them their freedom. So what then the United States did is they kind of backed it on up and said, you know what? You're really close to us. You're 100 miles off our border. We cannot risk the idea that you might be overtaken by another hostile force again. So here are the contingencies to your freedom, to us saying you can govern yourselves. Number one, the U.S. is allowed to intervene if it looks like Cuba is being threatened by being taken over by foreign control. The second thing that allowed Cuba to have their freedom is we get to put a military base there. We get to defend the United States in that area. Another thing that we see happens, because remember, we gained the Philippines. Well, the Filipino people, they wanted their freedom also, and they fought the United States to be able to get that. Of course, they lost, but that kind of angered some people because we're kind of now looking a little bit like a bully. But the Americans kind of, the way they viewed the situation is, you're too easily captured. You're not strong enough to defend yourselves. So we took over the Filipino people. They weren't very happy about that. They never were very happy about that. But after World War II, after we again freed them from Japanese control, Japanese occupation, they were granted their freedom. That was all the way after World War II. So we see a lot of this happen, but because of how aggressive this really could have looked to some people, a group began to emerge called the Anti-Imperialist League. And basically their thought process was, if you're controlling somebody and they don't want to be controlled by you, that kind of scratches a nerve with American philosophy, because that's exactly what we fought for our freedom for. We don't want to be controlled. We want to control ourselves. And so the Anti-Imperialist League, they had a big problem with gaining control of the Philippines. Another thing that really caused a problem with them was the annexing of Hawaii. Again, here's another people group who really did not want American control, but they were a key position in the Pacific Ocean. Again, if they were taken over by China, Japan, any of our enemies, that would be a perfect launching point to attack the United States. And of course, we saw exactly how pivotal Hawaii would be when we see the bombing of Pearl Harbor, bringing us into the Second World War. So we see a lot of this going on. It's rubbing different people different ways, but we can see that America is becoming a key force within the global community. We are now being viewed as a world power. We have strategic footholds to defend our country. We're showing that we can enter a place and that we can be successful in battle that's not on our shores. So we can deploy and battle and still be successful. So America is really kind of building this resume as being one of the primary world powers, even back during this period of history. But when we grow, there's always going to be growing pains. Some people are going to like it. Some people are not going to be liking it. We see the best of some people, like we saw with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. We see the manipulativeness of people, like with William Randolph Hearst. The point that we need to remember that is that we are all all of us, fallible human beings. We all have sin nature that we have to fight. And if we don't base our point of view starting with what does God have to say? What does Scripture have to say? If we start with what somebody else has to say, that's always where our problems are going to begin. So this is where I'm going to leave you on the PowerPoint slide that you can look at in a moment. We'll start walking through the map and the other page together. So I kind of hope you like my special little extra insights to the Spanish-American War, and keep reading and know your history. That way you're going to be informed as you go forward in the future. I love and miss you guys, and I'll talk to you later.